I remember the exact sound the datapad made when Elena Cortez placed it on the council dais. It was a soft click, barely louder than a breath, and yet that single sound would echo through galactic history louder than any war drum ever had. I had been sitting in my chair, the same chair I had occupied for over 400 years as senior arbiter of the Galactic Council. I had watched species rise and fall from that chair. I had brokered peace treaties and signed death warrants for entire civilizations. I had seen empires crumble and new ones claw their way up from the dust. Nothing surprised me anymore. At least, that is what I believed until that afternoon. Elena walked into the chamber without her usual delegation. No aides, no translators, no security escort. Just a woman in a dark gray uniform, carrying a single datapad. She moved through the hall with the kind of calm that made you look twice. The kind of stillness that did not belong in a room full of 11,000 species, all shouting over each other about trade tariffs. She placed the datapad on the dais, looked directly at me, and smiled. Not a bitter smile, not a victorious one. It was the kind of smile you give someone when you know something they do not, and you feel sorry for them because of it. "The formal notice of humanity's withdrawal from the Galactic Council," she said. Her voice did not shake. Her hands did not tremble. She said it the way you might tell someone the weather. Then she turned and walked out. The chamber went silent for exactly 3 seconds. I counted them. 3 seconds of pure, confused silence from a room that had not been quiet in 600 years. Then Ambassador Torek of the Torvathi started laughing. It was a high, rasping sound, and it spread across the chamber like a virus. Within moments, half the delegates were chuckling, shaking their heads, whispering to each other about how the short species was throwing a tantrum. I did not laugh. Something about the way Elena had moved bothered me. It was too clean, too rehearsed. Not in the way a politician rehearses a dramatic exit, but in the way a surgeon moves through a procedure they have performed 1,000 times. There was no emotion to decode. There was nothing to argue against. She had simply stated a fact and left. I picked up the datapad and read the formal withdrawal. It was 4 paragraphs long. Polite, professional. It thanked the Council for 80 years of partnership. It wished every member species continued prosperity. It confirmed that all human personnel would vacate Council facilities within 30 days. That was it. No list of grievances, no demands, no threats, no conditions under which they might return. That night, I tried to contact Elena through the secure diplomatic channel that had connected our offices for the last 12 years. The channel was already deactivated. Not blocked, not encrypted with a new key I did not possess. Deactivated entirely, as if the connection had never existed in the first place. I sat in my quarters staring at the blank communication screen for a long time. In my 4 centuries of service, I had seen 19 species withdraw from the Council. Every single one of them had done it with noise. They slammed doors. They made speeches. They issued ultimatums packed with conditions designed to be met so they could come back without losing dignity. They kept their communication channels open because leaving was never really about leaving. It was about leverage. Humans had cut the line entirely. The next morning, I submitted a formal request to investigate the withdrawal. The Council voted it down within the hour. Delegate after delegate stood up to explain why humanity's departure was inconsequential. They were a young species, barely 80 years in the galactic community. Their technology was derivative. Their military was modest. Their cultural contributions were, in the words of the Torvathi ambassador, charming but provincial. I listened to all of this and said nothing. I had learned centuries ago that arguing with confident people is a waste of time. Instead, I walked down to the human embassy complex on the lower levels of the station. The halls were empty, not abandoned. Empty. There is a difference, and it matters. An abandoned space has chaos in it. Things left behind in a hurry, drawers pulled open, personal items scattered on the floor. This was nothing like that. Every desk was clean. Every drawer was closed. The nameplates had been removed from every door, and the small holes where they had been mounted were filled in and painted over. The kitchen had been scrubbed. The meeting rooms smelled faintly of cleaning solution. They had been packing for weeks, maybe months. Long before Elena placed that datapad on my dais, Humanity had already made their decision and begun the quiet work of untangling themselves from our systems. They had done it so carefully, so gradually, that none of us had noticed. I found a maintenance log in the facilities office. It showed that the humans had repaired 2 malfunctioning air recyclers in the East Corridor, replaced a faulty water filtration unit in the medical wing, and recalibrated the station's secondary navigation beacon, all in their last week. They had spent their final days fixing things for a station they were about to leave forever. That detail stayed with me. It kept me awake for 3 nights. In the weeks that followed, I watched the Council move on with remarkable speed. Humanity's departure was processed as a bureaucratic formality. Their seat was dissolved. Their committee memberships were redistributed. Their file archives were marked as inactive and moved to deep storage. On paper, it was as if they had never been here at all. But paper does not run a space station. Paper does not mediate trade disputes between volatile species. Paper does not catalog hazardous debris fields in shipping lanes or organize supply chains for refugee camps on the outer reach. Humans did those things, and in the confident rush to erase them from the record, nobody stopped to ask who would do them now. I submitted a second report, flagging 64 operational functions that had been managed exclusively by human staff. The Council acknowledged receipt and took no action. I was told the functions would be absorbed organically by existing personnel. On the 45th day after the withdrawal, I received a short message from Elena Cortez. It had been sent through civilian channels, not diplomatic ones. It said, "Counselor Dross, it was a genuine honor working with you. I hope you will not think less of us. We simply grew tired of carrying a house that had no room for us inside it." I read that message 17 times. Then I closed it and did not reply, because I did not yet understand what it meant. The Torvathi threw a reception to celebrate what they called a return to proper galactic order. They served expensive wine and made jokes about human cooking. I attended because protocol demanded it. I stood in the corner and watched 11 species toast each other for the departure of the one species that had been keeping their systems running. And I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. I felt afraid. Not the sharp, immediate fear of a predator in the dark. This was slower. It was the kind of fear that settles into your bones over hours. The kind that comes when you look at a wall and notice, for the first time, a crack that has been growing for years. You do not know when the wall will fall. You just know that it will, and that you are standing too close to it. The humans had not left in anger. That was the part nobody understood. Anger is manageable. Anger negotiates. Anger comes back to the table, because it still cares enough to fight. What Elena had shown me was something far worse than anger. It was acceptance. The calm, clean acceptance of someone who has weighed every option, grieved every alternative, and arrived at a decision they will never revisit. I closed my personal log that night with a note I did not share with anyone on the Council. It read, "That should have been the warning. Species that leave in anger always keep the line open. Humans cut theirs like they never planned to call back." 3 months later, the first system failed, and I learned that warnings unheard are just noise. It began with something so small that it took me 11 days to even notice it was missing. Every quarter, for the last 60 years, a document arrived in every Council delegate's secure inbox. It was called the Galactic Hazard Navigation Update. It cataloged debris fields, radiation pockets, unstable wormhole apertures, rogue asteroid clusters, and every other invisible danger lurking in the shipping lanes between major systems. Pilots relied on it. Trade fleets built their seasonal routes around it. Insurance syndicates used it to calculate risk premiums for cargo vessels crossing contested space. It did not arrive. I assumed it was late. Administrative delays happen even in well-run systems. I flagged it with the Operations Directorate and went about my day. A week later, I flagged it again. This time, a junior clerk ran a trace and came back to me with a look on her face that I did not like at all. "Counselor Dross," she said, "the Hazard Navigation Update was compiled and distributed by the Human Cartographic Division. They produced it, maintained the sensor networks that fed into it, and ran the analytical models that predicted hazard migration patterns. No other department has the data, the tools, or the trained staff to generate it." I sat with that for a moment. 60 years. For 60 years, humanity had been producing the single most important safety document in galactic shipping, and not one of us had ever asked who was responsible for it. We just assumed it appeared, the way you assume the air will be breathable when you wake up in the morning. That was the first crack. The second came 4 days later. A mediation channel between the Drenaki Trade Consortium and the Vashani Commerce Guild had gone dark. These two blocks had been locked in a low-grade trade war for over a century, and the only thing preventing it from escalating into actual conflict was a dedicated human mediation team that ran continuous back-channel negotiations, translated cultural nuances that automated systems missed, and occasionally hosted informal dinners where representatives from both sides could talk without the pressure of official records. The mediation team was gone. The channel was dead. Within 2 weeks, the Drenaki imposed a 40% tariff on Vashani fuel exports, and the Vashani retaliated by blockading 3 Drenaki mining colonies. I received urgent communications from both sides, demanding that the council intervene. When I asked the diplomatic corps to deploy a replacement mediation team, I was told that no current staff had the cross-cultural training or the institutional relationships to do what the humans had done. I started pulling records. I could not help myself. Every day, I dug deeper into the operational infrastructure of the council, and every day, I found more human fingerprints in places I had never thought to look. They had been running the early warning sensor network in the Drenaki corridor, a critical trade route used by over 900 species. They had been managing the logistics chain that delivered famine relief supplies to 17 colonies in the outer reach. They had been staffing the overnight monitoring shifts at the Deep Space Listening Array, the system that detected incoming threats before they reached populated space. They had been maintaining the translation databases that allowed council delegates to communicate in real time across 4,000 languages. I counted the roles. The number was staggering. Over 1,200 administrative, technical, and operational positions across council systems had been filled by human volunteers, not high-ranking positions. Not glamorous ones. These were the jobs that nobody wanted. Sanitation logistics, data entry for refugee registration, calibration of atmospheric sensors on remote stations, night shift emergency dispatchers, filing clerks in the legal archives, the invisible, grinding, thankless work that keeps a civilization from falling apart. Every single one of those positions was now vacant, and not one other species had volunteered to fill them. I brought this information to the council in a formal session. I presented the numbers clearly. I showed the operational gaps. I outlined the cascading failures that would result if these positions remained unfilled. I spoke for 40 minutes, and when I finished, Ambassador Torek of the Torvathi leaned into his microphone and said, "We ran the galaxy for 10,000 years before humans crawled out of their gravity well. I think we will manage." The chamber applauded. I returned to my seat and noticed something I had never seen on Torek's face before. It was subtle, just a flicker around the eyes, a tension in the jaw that his species displays when they are uncertain. He had said the words with authority, but the confidence behind them had a hairline fracture in it, and I was perhaps the only one in the room old enough to recognize what that fracture meant. The third crack came hard and fast, and this time people died. The Drenaki Corridor sensor network had been offline for 7 weeks when the first freighter convoy disappeared. 42 ships carrying industrial equipment and medical supplies to a developing colony in the Nalveth system entered the corridor and never emerged. Search teams found the wreckage 3 days later. The convoy had flown directly into an uncharted radiation burst from a dying star. The burst would have been detected, flagged, and routed around if the sensor network had been operational. 731 crew members died because nobody was watching the screen. The second convoy was lost 11 days later. Different corridor, same cause. A debris field from a recent asteroid collision had drifted into a major shipping lane. Under the old system, the human hazard team would have detected the drift within hours and issued a rerouting advisory. Under the new system, there was no hazard team, no detection, and no advisory. 219 more dead. I stood in the council chamber after the second loss and watched delegates argue about blame. The Drenaki accused the Vashani of sabotage. The Vashani accused the Drenaki of incompetence. The Torvathi suggested forming a committee to study the issue. 3 other species demanded an emergency military escort for all trade convoys. which would have crippled galactic commerce for a decade. Nobody mentioned the humans. Nobody said the words that I could not stop thinking. We had this. We had a system that worked. We had people who ran it, for free, without complaint, for 60 years, and we let them walk away without even asking them to stay. I went back to my quarters and opened my personal archive. I pulled up every interaction I had ever had with a human council employee. There were hundreds of them. Brief conversations in hallways, shared meals in the lower cafeteria, a human technician named Simon Drake who had fixed my office terminal 3 times and refused payment each time, a logistics coordinator named Laura Bennett who had once reorganized the entire emergency supply chain for the Outer Reach colonies during a solar storm and never received a commendation for it because nobody in leadership knew she had done it. I thought about Simon Drake. He was a quiet man with rough hands and a patient smile. Every time he fixed my terminal, he would explain what had gone wrong in simple language, not because he thought I was stupid, but because he genuinely wanted me to understand. The last time I saw him, 2 weeks before the withdrawal, he had been carrying a box of tools down the corridor. I had nodded at him. He had nodded back. That was it. I never asked him how he was doing. I never asked any of them. In 400 years of service, I had memorized the names and genealogies of every major ambassador in the council. I could recite Torvathi bloodline hierarchies from memory. I knew the mating customs of the Vishani and the religious festivals of the Drenaki, but I could not tell you the last name of a single human maintenance worker who had kept my air clean, my water safe, and my data systems running for 8 decades. That night, I wrote a single line in my personal log and then closed it, because I could not bring myself to write anything more. The line read, "We had not just lost a member species. We had lost the only people willing to do the work that no one else would even look at." The council appointed a task force to address the operational gaps. The task force met 4 times, produced a 90-page report recommending the creation of a new administrative corps, and then dissolved when not a single member species volunteered to contribute staff. The report was filed and forgotten. The gaps remained. And somewhere out beyond our borders, in a small solar system that most galactic maps barely bothered to label, humanity continued on without us, and I was beginning to suspect that they were doing just fine. The emergency alert hit my console at 3 in the morning, station time, and for the first time in a century, I did not recognize the priority code. It was not a military incursion code. It was not a natural disaster code. It was a humanitarian crisis code. A designation that had been created 40 years ago by a human delegate named Philip Warren, who had argued for 2 years that the council needed a dedicated emergency classification for civilian population emergencies. The council had adopted it reluctantly, and then promptly forgotten it existed. Now it was blinking on my screen, because 80,000 Vaelshi refugees were stranded on a dying station in the Keltrith sector, and nobody knew what to do about it. I pulled on my robes and reached the council chamber in 12 minutes. I was not the first to arrive, but I was the first to notice that the chamber felt wrong. There were delegates everywhere, shouting, waving datapads, demanding attention from a podium that had no speaker. The emergency session had been called, but no one was running it. In the old days, a human crisis coordinator would have been at the podium within 5 minutes of an alert, with a preliminary assessment, a resource inventory, and a proposed action plan already drafted. That role no longer existed. I took the podium myself. It took me 20 minutes to establish order, and by the time I did, the Vaelshi ambassador was weeping openly. His people were trapped on a station with failing life support, and 12 species were arguing about jurisdictional authority over the sector where the station was located. "Whose sector is it?" the Drenaki delegate demanded. "The sector is in disputed territory," the Vashani delegate shot back. "Any unilateral action would constitute a violation of the Keltrith Accords." "People are dying," the Vaelshi ambassador said, and no one acknowledged him. I listened to this argument for 9 days. 9 days of procedural debates, jurisdictional challenges, legal interpretations, and diplomatic posturing, while 80,000 civilians rationed their air supply and watched their children grow sick from contaminated water. On the 4th day, I locked myself in my office and pulled up the operational records of the Human Rapid Response Corps. I needed to understand what we had lost, The records were meticulous, because of course they were. Humans documented everything. The Corps had been a volunteer unit, staffed entirely by human personnel, who rotated in from Earth on 6-month deployments. They received no council salary. Their equipment was purchased with human funds. Their training was conducted at human facilities. The council had never once contributed a single credit to their operation. In their 38 years of existence, the Rapid Response Corps had responded to 147 humanitarian emergencies across council space. They had provided shelter, food, medical care, and evacuation services to over 12 million refugees from 63 different species. Their average deployment time, from alert to boots on the ground, was 41 hours. It had been 9 days since the Velshi alert, and the council had not yet agreed on which committee should be responsible for drafting a response proposal. On the 6th day, 2,000 Velshi died when a secondary life support module failed. The council held a moment of silence and then resumed debating jurisdiction. I could not stay in that chamber any longer. I walked out, took a transport to the lower levels, and did something I had been avoiding for months. I went to the human embassy complex. The seal on the main door was still intact. I used my Arbiter's override to open it. The lights came on automatically as I entered, responding to motion sensors that the humans had installed and that still worked perfectly 7 months after their departure. The air was stale but clean. The corridors were silent. I walked through every office, every common room, every workspace. It was exactly as I remembered from my first visit after the withdrawal. Clean, organized, final. But this time, I was not just looking, I was searching. I found them in the operations center on the 3rd floor. Filing cabinets, physical ones, filled with bound documents. Each document was a manual. They were organized by department: logistics, communications, medical response, hazard monitoring, refugee services, infrastructure maintenance, diplomatic support, legal archiving, translation services. Every manual was written in clear, simple language with step-by-step instructions, diagrams, troubleshooting guides, and contact protocols. The humans had known. They had known that when they left, everything they maintained would collapse. And instead of using that knowledge as leverage, instead of threatening the council with the chaos that would follow their departure, they had quietly, patiently, meticulously written down everything they knew so that someone else could continue the work. I sat down in a chair that still held the faint impression of whoever had last sat in it, and opened the Refugee Services Manual. It was 400 pages long. It covered everything from initial needs assessment to long-term resettlement planning. There were templates for shelter layouts, optimized for 20 different atmospheric compositions. There were dietary guides for over 500 species. There were psychological support protocols adapted to the neurological profiles of every known sentient race in council space. A human team had spent years compiling this, years of work, distilled into a document that no one had asked for the benefit of people who had never thanked them. I found the note on page 1 of the logistics manual. It was handwritten, which was unusual for humans in a digital age. It said, "We were happy to help. We just got tired of being the only ones who were." I read that note 5 times, and on the 5th reading, I understood what Elena Cortez had meant when she said they had grown tired of carrying a house that had no room for them inside it. It was not about recognition. It was not about power or seats at the table or voting rights. It was about reciprocity. Humans had poured their energy, their creativity, their compassion into a system that took everything they offered and gave nothing back. Not out of malice, out of habit. We had simply grown accustomed to their generosity and mistaken it for obligation. I took the manuals back to my office, all of them. It took 4 trips. I sent copies to every department head in the council with a message that read, "The humans left us instructions. Perhaps we should use them." 3 department heads responded. 2 said thank you. 1 asked if the manuals were available in a different format, because the font was hard to read on his species' visual spectrum. The rest did not reply. On the 11th day of the Velshi crisis, the council finally approved a response plan. It was a compromise so diluted that it amounted to sending a single medical frigate with a crew of 40 to a station housing 80,000 refugees. The frigate arrived on day 14, and was immediately overwhelmed. I spent that evening in my office running projections. Without the human Rapid Response Corps, the Council's average crisis response time had increased from 41 hours to 312 hours. In humanitarian terms, that difference was measured in bodies. The following week, I proposed that the Council create a permanent emergency response division modeled on the human core. The proposal required member species to contribute personnel and funding. It was voted down. The Torvathi argued it was too expensive. The Dranaki said it infringed on sovereign military structures. The Vashani abstained because they were still angry about the trade tariffs. After the vote, I stood alone in the empty chamber and looked at the 11,000 seats arranged in their perfect concentric rings. Each seat represented a species that had achieved faster-than-light travel, mastered genetic engineering, built civilizations spanning hundreds of worlds. These were the most advanced beings in the known universe, and not one of them could bring themselves to do what humans had done for free. I returned to the human embassy one last time. I walked through the operations center and stopped at a wall near the back exit. Someone had mounted a simple frame containing a photograph. It showed a group of about 30 humans in work clothes, standing in front of a temporary shelter on what looked like a barren moon. They were smiling. Behind them, a line of alien refugees, species I could not identify from the image, were filing into the shelter. Some of the refugees were looking back at the humans with expressions that I recognized across every species I had ever encountered. It was gratitude. Beneath the photograph, someone had written a single word in black ink on the wall. The word was always. They had meant it too. They would have done it always, for every species, in every crisis, without payment and without thanks, because that was what humans did. It was not strategy. It was not politics. It was something hardwired into their biology, something that made them incapable of watching another living being suffer without reaching out a hand. We had that. We had that, and we let it walk out the door, because we were too proud to say the two words that might have made them stay. Thank you. I sealed the embassy behind me and walked back to my office. The Vaelshi crisis was still unfolding. 3 more species had filed formal complaints about the inadequacy of the Council's response. Somewhere in the Keltrith sector, people were still dying. And somewhere beyond our borders, the people who would have saved them were building a life without us. The delegation ship was small and fast, a diplomatic courier that could cross the distance between Council Central and the Sol system in 9 days. I had chosen it deliberately. I did not want the grand flagship that the Protocol Office had suggested. I did not want the ceremonial escort of warships that Ambassador Torek had insisted on. I wanted to arrive quietly, because I had learned from watching the humans that the loudest entrances often produce the weakest outcomes. There were 4 of us on the delegation. Myself as lead ambassador, a Vaelshi translator named Kethrin who had volunteered because her people still remembered what the Human Rapid Response Corps had done for them decades ago, a Drenaki legal advisor, whose name I have chosen not to record because he spent most of the journey complaining about the food, and a council records officer who was there to document whatever happened for the official archive. The council had authorized this mission with unusual speed. It had taken only 3 votes instead of the usual 12, because the situation had become impossible to ignore. In the year since humanity's withdrawal, the Council had lost control of 4 major trade routes, failed to respond adequately to 11 humanitarian emergencies, seen 2 minor species withdraw from membership, and suffered a 27% decline in overall administrative efficiency. The phrase, "before the humans left," had become a common refrain in committee meetings, spoken sometimes with frustration, sometimes with embarrassment, and increasingly, with something that sounded very much like grief. Our mandate was simple: bring them back. Offer whatever it takes. The council had authorized me to extend a permanent senior seat with full voting rights, a dedicated human representative on every major committee, resource-sharing agreements covering energy, technology, and territorial claims, and a formal public apology for the decades of institutional neglect. It was the most generous package the council had ever assembled for any species, and I carried it with me, like a peace offering to a god I was not sure still wanted our prayers. We entered the Sol system on a Tuesday by the human calendar. I know this because Elena Cortez told me later, and the detail struck me as important for reasons I could not articulate at the time. Tuesdays, she said, were unremarkable days. Humans did their most important work on unremarkable days. The approach to Earth was not what I expected. I had anticipated a system still recovering from the economic shock of separation from galactic trade networks. What I saw was something else entirely. The orbital lanes were busy, not chaotic but purposefully crowded, filled with construction drones, cargo haulers, and passenger shuttles moving between Earth, its moon, and a dozen orbital stations that I was certain had not existed a year ago. We were hailed by a polite traffic controller who assigned us a docking berth at a station called Port Meridian. The station was clean, modern, and efficient in a way that reminded me of the human embassy before they had stripped it bare. A greeting party met us at the airlock, 3 humans in civilian clothes. No military, no ceremony, no armed guards. A young man named Daniel Hurst shook my hand and said, "Welcome to Sol, Counselor Dross. Ambassador Cortez is expecting you. Would you like something to eat first?" I said no. I wanted to see Elena immediately. Daniel nodded and led us through the station without any attempt to delay, detour, or control what we saw. This was itself a statement. Every diplomatic visit I had ever conducted with a council species involved carefully managed routes designed to show the visitor only what the host wanted them to see. The humans simply let us walk through their world. What I saw unnerved me. Port Meridian was a trading hub, and the ships docked alongside ours did not belong to council species. I recognized markings from the Tenari, a small species that had been denied council membership 3 times for failing to meet minimum fleet requirements. I saw cargo containers stamped with Naylori script, another minor species, that the council had classified as pre-industrial and excluded from trade networks. There were at least 7 species represented at Port Meridian that the council had ignored, dismissed, or actively marginalized. Humanity had not retreated into isolation. They had built new alliances, quiet partnerships with the species that the rest of the galaxy had thrown away. Elena Cortez met us in a conference room overlooking Earth. She had aged in the year since I had last seen her. Her hair was shorter, threaded with gray, and she moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had too much work and too little time. But her eyes were clear and calm, and when she smiled at me, it was the same smile she had given me on the day she placed the withdrawal notice on my dais. The smile of someone who knew something I did not. "Counselor Dross," she said, "it is good to see you." "Ambassador Cortez," I said. "I wish the circumstances were different." She gestured for us to sit. There was tea on the table, actual Earth tea, prepared in the way humans preferred it. She poured cups for everyone, including the Dreniki legal advisor, who stared at his with suspicion before taking a sip and saying nothing, which for a Dreniki was the highest possible compliment. I presented the council's offer. I did it carefully, methodically, with full details on every concession. The senior seat, the committee representation, the resource sharing, the formal apology. I laid it all out on the table like a merchant displaying his finest goods, and I watched Elena's face for any sign of interest, excitement, or temptation. She listened to every word. She asked clarifying questions about the resource sharing ratios and the structure of the committee representation. She took notes on a small paper pad, which I found endearing and archaic. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me for a long time without speaking. "Counselor Dross," she said, "I want you to understand that I am speaking not only for myself, but for the people of Earth when I say this. We appreciate the offer. We recognize the significance of the concessions involved, and we must respectfully decline." The Dreniki legal advisor opened his mouth to object. I held up a hand to silence him. "May I ask why?" I said. Elena folded her hands on the table. "Because the offer proves exactly why we left. You are not offering us partnership. You are offering us compensation for services rendered. You want us back because the systems we maintained are failing without us, not because you value us as equals. If the council were functioning perfectly, this delegation would never have been sent." I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that the council had always valued humanity, that this was about more than operational gaps. But I could not say those words, because they would have been lies, and Elena Cortez was the kind of person who could see a lie the way an astronomer sees a star, clearly, and from a very great distance. "What would it take?" I asked instead. She shook her head. "It is not about what it would take. We have moved on. Not with anger, not with resentment. We have simply found a better way to spend our energy." She stood and asked if I would like to see something. I said yes. She led me out of the conference room, through a corridor, and into a transport that took us down to the surface. We landed in a coastal city that I later learned was called Brighton, on an island nation that humans called England. The city was alive in a way that I had never experienced on any council world. People moved through the streets with purpose but not urgency. Children ran along a waterfront promenade, chasing each other and laughing. Street vendors sold food that smelled extraordinary. Musicians played instruments on a corner. And people stopped to listen, dropped small tokens of currency into an open case, and moved on. Elena led me to a school. It was a large building with wide windows and a garden in the courtyard where children were growing plants in small containers. Inside, a class was in session. The children were perhaps 8 or 9 years old, and they were studying a projected display of the galaxy. I watched the lesson through a window. The teacher, a woman named Grace Palmer, was explaining the different regions of the galaxy, the major star clusters, the trade routes, the habitable zones. The children asked questions with the kind of fearless curiosity that only the very young possess. One boy asked if there were aliens who looked like octopuses. The teacher laughed and said, "Some of them did, actually." I searched the display for any mention of the Galactic Council. I looked at the maps, the labels, the text annotations. The council was not there. It was not mentioned. It was not part of the curriculum. Humanity had already written us out of their future. Elena saw me looking and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "We teach them about the galaxy, because the galaxy is wonderful. We do not teach them about the council, because the council is not part of our story anymore." I stood outside that school and felt something break inside me that I do not think will ever fully heal. I had come to offer humanity everything we had once denied them, and they looked at me the way you look at someone trying to sell you something you no longer need. We stayed in the Sol system for 3 more days. I toured their new orbital facilities. I met engineers who were building faster-than-light drives, using designs that council scientists had deemed theoretically impossible. I spoke with human diplomats who were establishing trade agreements with 12 species that the council had never bothered to contact. I ate dinner with Daniel Hurst and his family, and learned that he had once served in the Rapid Response Corps and still kept his old uniform in a closet, not out of nostalgia, but out of respect for what it represented. On the last evening, Elena walked me back to the docking port. We stood at the airlock and looked at each other, and for the first time, I saw something in her eyes that was not calm or controlled. It was sadness, not for herself, for me. "I am sorry, Vathan," she said, using my first name for the first and only time. "We did not want to leave, we just could not stay." I boarded my ship and left the Sol system. The journey back to Council Central took 9 days. I spent every one of them sitting in the observation lounge, staring at the stars, thinking about a classroom full of human children who were learning about the galaxy without us in it. I submitted my resignation on a morning that felt no different from any other, which seemed appropriate. The extraordinary things in this story had always happened quietly, and I saw no reason for my ending to be any louder than the one that started it all. 3 years had passed since humanity's withdrawal. I was sitting in the same chair I had occupied for over 4 centuries, in a chamber that now had 914 empty seats where delegates used to sit. 2 species had formally withdrawn in the first year, 5 more followed in the second. The third year brought a cascade that no one had predicted but everyone should have seen coming. Minor species, the ones with small fleets and modest economies, the ones the council had always treated as background noise, began leaving in clusters. They did not make speeches. They did not issue ultimatums. They placed datapads on the dais, smiled, and walked out. They had learned it from the humans. I spent that final morning reviewing the state of the galaxy as I understood it. The Drenaki corridor was still partially closed. The sensor network had been rebuilt by a private Tanari human consortium, but they controlled the data now and sold access to it at market rates. The council, which had once received this service for free, could not afford the premium tier. We were navigating our own trade routes using outdated charts and guesswork. The outer reach colonies were in crisis. Without the human-managed supply chains, famine relief had become sporadic, dependent on whichever member species could be shamed into contributing resources on a case-by-case basis. The Valshi, who had suffered the most during the Keltrith station disaster, had withdrawn from the Council entirely and signed a mutual aid treaty with Earth. Their ambassador had sent me a personal note before departing. It read, "The humans came for us when no one else would. We will not forget." The Deep Space Listening Array was operating at 31% capacity. The overnight monitoring shifts, which humans had staffed voluntarily for decades, were now covered by an automated system that missed approximately 1 in every 4 threat signatures. A Drenaki patrol fleet had nearly been destroyed by an undetected asteroid swarm because the array had classified it as background radiation. The fleet survived, but the Drenaki filed a formal complaint so severe that it nearly triggered a military response against the station. The translation databases had not been updated in 2 years. Council sessions now required physical translator pods stationed between every delegation cluster, creating a noise problem so severe that the chamber's acoustic systems could not compensate. 3 separate diplomatic incidents had been caused by translation errors that the old human-maintained system would have caught instantly. I looked at the numbers and saw what any rational observer would see. The Council was not dying. Dying implies a single cause, a clear trajectory from health to illness to death. This was something worse. The Council was dissolving, losing coherence the way a structure loses integrity when you remove the bolts one by one. It still looked like a building from the outside, but step inside and you could feel the floor shifting under your feet. The Torvathi, who had laughed the loudest when the humans left, were the ones I watched most carefully. Ambassador Torek had stopped attending full council sessions 6 months ago, citing health reasons that everyone knew were fabricated. His species was proud to the point of self-destruction, and admitting that they had been wrong about humanity was a concession their culture was not designed to make. Instead, they had quietly begun sending private diplomatic feelers to Earth. I knew this because Kethrin, my Vaelshi translator from the Sol mission, had contacts in the Tanari trade network who reported unusual Torvathi ship traffic near the Sol system border. The Torvathi were not trying to bring humanity back to the Council. They were trying to build their own relationship, outside of Council structures, because they had finally understood what I had understood years ago. The Council was no longer the center of galactic civilization. It was a relic, a grand building with a beautiful facade and nothing behind it. I wrote my resignation letter in longhand, which is unusual for my species, but felt right given the circumstances. I addressed it to the Deputy Arbiter, a competent Nashtari named Sevoth who had served under me for 90 years, and who deserved better than the institution I was leaving her. Before I sealed the letter, I pulled up a file I had been carrying for 3 years. It was the formal withdrawal message that humanity had submitted on the day of their departure, the one attached to Elena Cortez's datapad, the one that the Council had processed as routine paperwork and never bothered to read carefully. I read it one more time. I had read it perhaps 100 times by now, and each reading revealed something new, like a painting that changes depending on the light. To the honorable delegates and member species of the Galactic Council, it began. The people of Earth wish to formally notify the Council of our decision to withdraw from membership, effective immediately. This decision was not made in haste. It is the product of years of careful reflection, internal debate, and genuine sorrow. We believe that the galaxy is better with cooperation. We also believe that cooperation must be mutual. It must be built on respect, reciprocity, and the recognition that every species, regardless of age or power, brings value to the collective whole. We have not found these principles reflected in our experience as council members. We do not blame any individual or species for this. We understand that institutions develop patterns over time, and that those patterns can become invisible to the people within them. We simply ask that our departure be taken not as an insult, but as an observation. We wish you well. We wish you growth. And we hope that one day, the galaxy will build something better than what exists today. No accusations. No demands, no anger. Just a clear, compassionate assessment, delivered with the kind of dignity that most species cannot manage, even when things are going well, let alone when they are walking away from everything they helped build. I thought about what Elena had told me in Brighton. We did not want to leave. We just could not stay. I understood now that those two sentences contained the entire tragedy of this story. Humans had not been driven out. They had not been persecuted or attacked. They had simply been ignored, consistently and completely, until the weight of that invisibility became heavier than their desire to help. I sealed my resignation letter and placed it on the deputy arbiter's desk. Then I walked through the station one final time. I passed through the corridors where human maintenance workers had once changed air filters and replaced lighting panels. I walked past the cafeteria, where human cooks had once prepared meals that catered to 40 different dietary requirements. Not because it was their job, but because they could not stand the thought of someone going hungry. I stopped at the medical bay where human nurses had once volunteered for double shifts during the Nalveth flu outbreak, and saved 400 lives that our official medical staff had written off as statistically insignificant. Every step was a memory, every corridor was a ghost. I ended my walk at the human embassy complex. The seal was still intact. No one had entered since my last visit, and I suspected no one would. The council had approved a proposal to convert the space into additional storage for the legal archives. The vote had been unanimous, which meant that not a single delegate had objected to erasing the last physical trace of human presence from Council Central. I did not go inside. I did not need to. I already knew what was in there: the clean desks, the filed manuals, the photograph of 30 smiling humans in front of a refugee shelter, the word "always" written on the wall. Instead, I pressed my hand against the door and held it there for a long time. It was a gesture that means something different in my culture than it does in human culture, but the intent was the same. It was goodbye. I took a transport to the Sol system 1 week later, not as a diplomat, not as a council representative. I went as a private citizen, using personal funds, with no agenda and no mandate. I simply wanted to see them one more time. Daniel Hurst met me at Port Meridian again. He looked well, stronger. He had been promoted to some kind of logistics role that he described with the casual modesty that humans apply to important work. He did not ask why I had come. He just said, "Good to see you, counselor," and then corrected himself. "Sorry, just Vathan now, right?" "Just Vathan," I confirmed. He took me to the surface. Not to Brighton this time, but to a city on a different continent, a sprawling, chaotic, beautiful place called Lagos. I walked through streets that hummed with energy. I watched humans build things, fix things, argue about things, help strangers carry heavy loads, give directions to lost visitors, and share food with people they had never met. I sat on a bench near a busy intersection and watched the world move around me for 3 hours. In that time, I saw a woman stop to help an elderly man cross a street. I saw 2 children share a meal with a stray animal. I saw a construction worker notice that a pedestrian barrier had fallen over and stop his vehicle to set it upright, losing 5 minutes of his day for the safety of people he would never know. These were not grand gestures. They were not heroic acts recorded in the annals of history. They were the small, invisible kindnesses that humans performed constantly, automatically, without thinking, as naturally as breathing. This was what we had lost. Not their technology, not their military, not their administrative efficiency. We had lost a species that could not walk past a broken thing without trying to fix it. I found Elena Cortez one last time. She was retired from diplomatic service and was teaching at a university. I visited her office, which was small and cluttered with books, actual paper books, stacked on every surface. She made tea, and we sat together in a comfortable silence that would have been impossible between 2 council diplomats, but felt natural between 2 tired people who had seen too much. "I resigned," I told her. She nodded as if she had expected this. "What will you do now?" "I do not know," I said. "Right, perhaps. Someone should record what happened." "Someone should," she agreed. I asked her the question that had lived in my chest for 3 years, the one I had never been brave enough to voice. "Do you think we deserved it? The council. Do you think we deserve to lose you?" Elena considered this for a long time. She sipped her tea. She looked out the window at a campus where young humans walked between buildings, carrying books and laughing and living their lives. "No," she said finally, Nobody deserves to lose something good, but not everything that is good is obligated to stay. I left Earth for the last time the following morning. The journey back was long, and I spent it writing. Not reports, not policy recommendations, not formal correspondence to institutions that would not listen. I wrote this account, everything I witnessed, everything I failed to prevent, everything I came to understand too late. The council did not fall because humans left. That is the easy version of the story, and I have never been comfortable with easy versions. The council fell because without humans, it had to face what it actually was. A collection of ancient, proud, powerful species who had built a system designed to benefit themselves and had forgotten, over thousands of years, what it meant to serve someone other than their own interests. Humans had not just been doing the work, they had been the example. Every time a human maintenance worker stayed late to fix a system that was not their responsibility, they were showing us what civilization was supposed to look like. Every time a human medic volunteered for a crisis response in a sector they had never visited, for a species they had never met, they were demonstrating a principle so simple that it embarrassed us that we had forgotten it. You take care of each other, not because it benefits you, not because it earns you power or prestige or a seat at the table. You take care of each other because that is what it means to be part of something larger than yourself. 11,000 species in the Galactic Council, and it took the youngest, smallest, most overlooked one among us to understand something that the rest of us had been too old and too proud to remember. I am recording this from a small station on the outer edge of Council space. The station is quiet. Most of the staff have transferred to busier posts closer to the core systems. The halls echo in a way they never used to. I keep the human logistics manual on my desk, the one from the embassy. I read it sometimes, not for the operational information, which is now outdated, but for the handwriting in the margins, notes from the people who wrote it, small observations, reminders to check on a refugee family in Sector 7, a doodle of a smiling face next to a particularly dense paragraph about supply chain routing, a note at the bottom of the final page that reads, "If you are reading this, we hope it helps. Good luck out there." They did not destroy us. They did not defeat us. They did not wage war, or issue threats, or burn our cities. They simply stopped carrying us, quietly and completely, and without malice, and we discovered that we had forgotten how to stand. That is the truth of what happened. That is what I need the galaxy to understand. Humanity did not bring down the Galactic Council. They just stopped holding it up.